Yo, footwork here. Let's talk. So, I want to talk about a little bit more about Devin Haney's win. All right, and what I saw and the style that he used as opposed to what we saw with Earl Spence a few weeks ago, a couple months ago, right? So, like I said before, Devin Haney came out, stuck to his game plan, boxed real smooth, in and out, using the jab all night, keeping George off balance, keeping him backing up, keeping him flailing, throwing punches, missing. And like I said before, if he had gone to the body, he would have stopped the kid. But I think he did the right thing. He played it safe because he didn't give Kambosos opportunities to catch him with something. So if you can win the fight with one punch all night long, it's easy work. And he could, instead of going in for the knockout, going to the body, doubling up top, stepping around, stepping inside, pushing Kambosos back, and putting some real hurt on him. You know, he could have just, the way he did was perfect. Just stay back, stay within himself, stay relaxed, box smooth, get the dub, and maybe next time you can come back and destroy him. But now let's take a look as opposed to what we saw with him and Earl Spence, right? Earl Spence went out there and he had the mentality that he was going to destroy his opponent. We're talking about Ugas. Yordenis Ugas was who he just unified his third title with. And when he went out there, he went out like an animal, stepping to his angle, stepping to the side, using his footwork, but his inside game is just top notch. And he always had an angle on Ugas where he could hit him, but Ugas couldn't return fire. He would always duck out of the way. But believe it or not, what I was seeing, because I was there, was that Earl was vulnerable. Because number one, he was rusty. Okay? And then number two, he was pushing himself to the limit to get that knockout. He would stop at nothing to get Ugas out of there. And that opened him up to getting clipped and getting hurt, which there was a couple times in there where Ugas backed him up with some hard shots, one to the body that Earl had to step back on. And he clipped him, of course, when Earl dropped his hands. But that was because Earl had that killer mentality going into that fight. He was going to stop at nothing to get that TKO. And he eventually got it, but he took risk in that fight, which what my point is that I admire both styles. The fact that the young kid stayed within himself, Devin Haney, boxed smooth, did his thing, and then Earl Spence went out there like a tiger, like an animal, to just go out there and destroy Ugas. But the contrast is that you're going to have to give some to get some. And so that's what you want to keep in mind when you're watching boxing. You want to watch that footwork. Devin Haney had his body angled in such a way that when he's reached out to touch his opponent with his jab, his body was almost straight down the middle of his opponent. And when George would square up, meaning that his shoulders are wide and facing Devin Haney, all Devin Haney had to do was reach out and touch him with the jab all night because he already had the reach advantage. So just keep that in mind whenever you're seeing the sport. The other thing is what Devin Haney's win represents. It represents change in the sport of boxing. Boxing, just like any other industry, has a lot of racism, has a lot of misrepresentation of black fighters in particular. And Devin Haney has his own promotional company. He's young, he's black, of course he's a businessman. And since he owns his own company, the big boys like Top Rank, they don't want to really do business with him because that's going to not only show that young black fighters can start their own companies and that might turn into an inspiration, but also that the established organizations like Top Rank, that could potentially be a threat because other fighters will start realizing, hey, I don't need the big guys. I can start my own company and come up the hard way and keep most of my earnings. So they have a lot of incentive to stop Devin Haney, and they did it at every turn. 3, 4 top-notch fighters in his weight class ducked the hell out of him. But he took a chance on himself. He bet on himself. He went out there and he became undisputed. So hats off again to him for doing that. But what I also want to do is kind of link what happened with Devin Haney and his rise and his come up to some events that happened a few months ago, right? So that being Deontay Wilder's last fight at heavyweight with Tyson Fury. So that just really kind of represents some of the ugly parts of the sport, where you probably already heard there's a lot of craziness that went on with the second fight with Fury, with the gloves, and Fury's got a shady history with his drug use and a whole bunch of other stuff, connections to gangsters in the UK or wherever, Germany, wherever the hell they're from. Bottom line is that this guy, he went into the fight. Okay, he lost the third fight with Fury, but he stood up strong. And he's always been kind of like a pro-black advocate. And I've watched Wilder since the days that he was in the Olympics. And that particular loss, it kind of showed the heavyweight title, is going to have to go to one side, whether they do it by hook or crook. But when you compare that to Crawford's win, or his lawsuit rather, Terrence Crawford was with Top Rank, and then he eventually left, and he's the next fighter probably that's going to be fighting Earl Spence, who I mentioned just before. He had this racism lawsuit against Bob Arum. And that particular lawsuit was charging racism and denying Terrence Crawford certain opportunities for big fights. But now that that's happened, now that this lawsuit is still kind of ongoing and it's out there, you're starting to notice now that more and more fighters are getting opportunities. So to kind of circle back to how Deontay Wilder, when he lost, there was a lot of criticism that came his way, with the loss of a lot of black fighters, and, black fighters don't have the kind of dominance that they may have had in decades past and things like that. But ever since that particular loss, you notice more and more fighters, black fighters I'm talking about, are becoming unified, multiple titles, and becoming undisputed. So one after another, you see this happening. You saw it with Charlo, you're seeing it with Haney, you saw it with Spence, and you got more that are coming up in the future. So it's kind of interesting to see this angle of the sport when you mix the politics, the boxing strategy, the opportunities that these fighters are getting out here, and they are making the most of it. So, I want you to keep this in mind in the backdrop as time goes forward and we get some of these other high-profile fights. The next big one, again, is going to be probably Earl Spence and Terrence Crawford in the fall. So I want you to also keep in mind the scorecards. These scorecards, they coming up kind of janky because these judges are giving favorite fighters with the biggest promotional companies the first 3-4 rounds before the fight even before they even go to distance. So keep that in mind when you're watching fights like Canelo, or when you're watching fights even like the one that just took place with George Kambosos and Devin Haney. Again, they gave this kid 4 rounds that he never won. That fight was a shutout, okay? So this is a little bit, just backdrop about what's going on. We're going to continue to add content. And I want you to also keep in mind history. History, I believe, is being made right now. I haven't done the research on this, but I believe this era has more black, undisputed, and unified fighters than any other era in boxing. We're talking about the 4-belt era. 4 belts meaning 4 titles per weight division. Now, in years past, I'm sure there's been a lot more, but in this new era, in the last 10, 15, 20 years or so, you probably are getting more and more closer to a record number of black fighters coming on with these multiple titles and unifying and becoming undisputed. And I expect that trend to continue. That's it for me. Make sure you like and subscribe. We're Fight Talk out.